When I go into any major city and I go into what is known as the black parts of town, I can't help but to notice the same pattern over and over. And those patterns are, as we all know, you got young folks standing on the corner. You got people staring down the cars every time you go past. You got people selling drugs. You got people strung out on drugs. You have a lot of hollering, a lot of screaming, a lot of people running in the streets. Life of hard times and struggle, a lot of violence. In fact, when you look up the statistics, you'll see that people who are labeled black people make up about 13% of the population in the United States of America, but they make up just about 50% of the people who commit murders, right? So these are some of the patterns that I recognize, and that many of you recognize as well, when you look into what is called black communities or in the black culture. And so when I began to ask these questions on exactly what is wrong with black people, I ended up going into the studies of the transatlantic slave trade and the formation of a slave society in the United States of America, going into that realm of study. And upon going into that realm of study, we see that it takes place in the 1600s, going up to the 1700s, 1800s, and even up further. But the setting back in the 1600s and the 1700s, we see the formation of a slave society taking place. And the elite Europeans are grabbing people of African descent and bringing them over to the United States to work the land. They're setting up a system that would have slaves, not just regular slaves, but eventually perpetual slaves. That means someone would be bought as a slave, then their children would be slaves, and their children would be slaves, and it would go on ad infinitum, right? It would continue to go. That's what the purpose was, a perpetual slaves. And so in order to establish that system, they had set up laws to establish that type of system. And that some of the laws stripped the enslaved people of all the rights, and it also created laws to where other people would shun or would be prohibited from allowing the enslaved people to have rights or even have their freedom, right? And so doing so, it created an environment to where the enslaved people had to form their thoughts, their opinions, and the way that they see themselves. They had the European colonizers place these enslaved peoples in these harsh environments, harsh conditions, beast-like conditions. And like I said, when you're placed and forced into these conditions with the laws and also the power of military to enforce the laws, you're trapped into a container of an environment. And from that container and that environment, the people, the enslaved people, began to develop a worldview. Part of that worldview is being dependent upon the slave masters, because this is all that they knew at this time, is to be dependent, right? So they learned how to be dependent at this time. Also, the ability to become educated was prohibited from the enslaved people. So they removed education from the enslaved, and instead they gave them religion, right? So that's one of the other things that is happening within this context and this environment that the Europeans are creating for the enslaved Africans, which are meant to be perpetual slaves. Another thing that occurred is that the Europeans began using propaganda to perpetuate the notion of these enslaved people as being inferior, being savage, being beast, being subhuman, and being a perpetual slave. This is what their propaganda was reinforcing, that these people were meant to be permanent slaves and nothing else because they're less than humans, right? This is what's taking place within the context and the environment that the enslaved people had to live in. And so also the Europeans, on top of all of this, they created a concept called race, right? This is what the European elite created from their imagination, a concept called race. And when we deal with the concept of race, we understand that it's a social status within society. And so the elite Europeans gave them and people with similar skin colors to them, they gave them the status of white. And we know that they're not, the skin color of them is not white. It's a social status, right? And also a legal status. they gave them the concept of white. And we know what's attached to white. All concepts, when you read in the dictionary, purity, moral goodness, someone who's just a great person, someone who's upstanding, godlike, all these type of things. Angel, when we think of the concept of white, the term white, the things that are attached to it are also lumped into that identity, right? This is going into the creation of race. In contrast to that, they gave the African descendants, and then they made up all type of other rules too, people who were mixed and one-drop rules, and anything that was not of a pure European essence or descendancy, they gave those people, more specifically of African ancestry, they gave them the term black. And we know that people of African ancestry are not black in color, different shades of brown, but they gave them the contrasting term, which is black. Black, when you look in the dictionary, there's other terms associated which we understand. Black is associated with terms or with ideas like wickedness, sinful, evil, immoral. All the things that are contrast to white is what black symbolizes. And it also is a lower status. And we understand that in the common Western ideology, when you say things like the black market, when you say things like black magic, when you say things like blacklisted, or someone was blackmailed, or that's a black cat, things that are attached to that, we have ideas associated with these terms, black, already in the unconscious parts of our minds. And so they attach that to the enslaved people, right? That's one of the first things that they did. And so these ideas are attached to both types of people that the European colonizers created through their own imagination in the astral realm. And so people labeled black were labeled as inferior, and people labeled white were labeled as superior. Then thus again reinforcing this perpetual slave that the colonizers are intending to create. And so these enslaved people who are placed within this confinement and in this environment, within this context, which the laws are forcing them in this context, the people around them with the power are forcing them within this context and with this environment. Eventually what happened is that those people began to believe those ideas that the colonizers had in their imagination and forced upon them. And when they began to believe it, that's when they began to become it. And what we have to understand is that these reinforced ideas come from the thoughts of the European colonizers in their imagination. And once the enslaved people began to accept those beliefs in the imagination of the colonizers of being savage, subhuman, less than human, inferior, violent, animal, all these ideas meant to be a perpetual slave and also a black person, once they begin to accept these ideas, then within that context that they're accepting these ideas, they begin creating a culture, right? Which is what all people do. All people create cultures, but they begin creating a culture within that context. And this is by force, right? They almost had no choice but to create a culture within that context. But that culture within that context reinforces the belief that they have accepted of being inferior, violent, animal, all these types of reinforced beliefs from the imagination of the colonizers, right? And they created that culture, and from there it began to evolve into what we see it as into today. And one thing we need to understand is that this was a forced creation, right? It was a forced creation. But once the chains were let off and once the enslaved were emancipated, we have to remember that their mind was already taken. Their mind was taken and it was replaced with other thoughts from the imagination of other people. And it was not forced upon them to change their ways. They were just kind of left on their own. Right? And from there, you stem off and you see the results of that when you go into the inner cities, when you go into what are called black neighborhoods. You see the descendants of those people and the evolved version of those thoughts right before your own eyes. And so going through this journey of trying to find the answer, what I've come to understand is that people labeled black, or who label themselves black now, have accepted and truly accepted the idea that the colonizers had in their imagination. And they act in accordance to that. And so what we have to understand is that when people accept beliefs about themselves and it becomes so deeply ingrained within their being, within the way they see the world, within the way that they see themselves, it's a seemingly impossible task to convince people or show people otherwise. And me, as being someone who used to identify as black, this is over a decade ago, I understand what that worldview looks like. And I also understand what it's like to not accept and not believe that worldview anymore. And from someone who's having an actual belief of not seeing themselves as what the colonizers had in mind, there's actions that needed to take place, which is a change in culture, a change in name, a change in the way of doing things, a change in beliefs. That's how you know when someone doesn't truly see themselves as that anymore. Those things start to manifest. Right? And so that's the only difference between myself as when I used to identify as black and now identifying as Earpoise. Right? As an identity that we've created for ourselves. And so doing this, I understand what it's like to be on both sides. And I also understand that when someone is immersed in a certain belief, that is what they believe to be true. And that is what they believe to be right in their own mind. And therefore, I have an understanding of why people do the things that they do and why they believe the way that they believe. It doesn't mean that I agree with it or I want to be around it, but I have an understanding of why it's done, right? And so when coming to this understanding, I reflect back on the question of what is wrong with black people? And then when I put everything into perspective, into its proper place and its proper context, I come to the understanding that there is absolutely nothing wrong with black people. And that black people are doing exactly what they are created to do and what they have also come to believe themselves to be. Right? So there's nothing wrong with black people. Nothing wrong with them at all. The same way that there's nothing wrong with anyone else. People do what they believe themselves to be, and they respond accordingly, and they act accordingly. Right? And you get in where you fit in. Right? So this is what I've come to conclude on my journey of finding out the question of what is wrong with black people, that there's absolutely nothing wrong with them. And hopefully you've got something out of this video. Maybe this has allowed you to think of something. Maybe it's planted a few seeds. Maybe it's gotten you to reconsider a few things about yourself and the way you perceive the world. Right? So my name is Brooklyn St. Michael. I want to thank you for watching the video. And I'll see you on the next one.